Okay. Welcome, everyone, to a random walk down Mill Street. Today, we are going to talk about the seventh day of Passover and let's see, just trying to get this to go right here. Seventh day of Passover and the Mill Street synagogues. And I thank you all for coming at a little bit later hour than usual and on a different day than usual. Tomorrow night will be the holiday, so obviously our Thursday night slot will not be available. So we're doing it Wednesday night, and thank you for coming. The Torah tells you that on Passover you have a 7-day holiday where you're not supposed to eat chametz, you have to eat matzah. On the first day, there's all sorts of explanations about the Exodus and what you have to remember and what you have to do. And for the seventh day, it just says Mikra Kodesh Yelechem. That it's to be a holiday for you. There's absolutely nowhere in the Torah that tells you what's supposed to be done, what if you're supposed to remember anything in particular. It doesn't give you any instruction. It just says Mikra Kodesh Yelechem. But we do know from our tradition that the seventh day of Passover is traditionally what we say the splitting of the sea occurred, and afterwards the spontaneous singing of the Shirah, of Shirat Hayam, that Moses and Miriam gathered together and they sang Shira Lanai Kigoga that they celebrated the defeat of the Egyptians who had been pursuing them and their miraculous salvation on this other side of the river, through dry land, to make it to the other side. And so as a result of that, we read for the Torah portion, the Shirat Hayam, and that becomes the theme of the holiday, musical, liturgical theme of the holiday. The singing of the Azashir, the melody that's used here at Sheretz Israel, is one of the more well-known and basic Spanish and Portuguese melodies. And it is, you probably know it. It goes like this: Az yashir Moshe ubnei Yisrael et hashira hazod ladonai vayomeru lemor. Same melody is used for Baruch haba b'shem Adonai berachnuchem mibeit Adonai el Adonai vaya'er lanu. So that melody, which is sung for the Az Yashir every Shabbat and every holiday morning, we've been doing it every morning through Chol Moed, is the musical theme of the day. I may have repeated some of that information when we did Parashat B'Shalach, when we read this section of the Torah in the order of the Parashiot, has the same melody. So we sing it for Ein Kelokeinu, Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu. And that is what you can do at home before Birkat Hamazon or just as a table song to remember the Az Yashir. Curiously enough, we also read this section of the Torah in a special trope, not the way we read, not the same nigun as we read for the rest of the Torah, but it's something called Hai Naum. And I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of it for you now. But on this day, despite it being the theme melody for all the holiday, for this seventh day of Passover, we're using the Hallel, using the Kaddish, we don't actually sing the Az Yashir to that melody. We only say it in the Hai Naum. So on a regular Zemirot, we would do we would do Vayibarach David, Adonai Lenei Kol Hakal, Vayomer David, and do all this Zemirot melody. When we get to Vayoshang Adonai, we switch to the Hai Naum, which is on the top right of your page here. I'm going to sing it for you now. Vayoshang Adonai bayom hahu et Yisrael miad Mitzrayim, vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim meit nal sefat hayam, Vaya Yisrael et hayad gedola asher nasa Adonai b'Mitzrayim vayiru hangam et Adonai vaya aminu b'Adonai u'Moshe abdo az yashir Moshe ובני ישראל את השירה הזאת לאדוני, ויאמרו לאמור השירה לאדוני, כי גאו גאה, סוס ורוכבו, רמה בים. And then it goes through the rest of the Shirah with the same way. This is during the Zemirot. This is not during the Torah reading. This is in the prayers before we read the Shachrit. The whole thing through the end, and then after Adonai Melech Le'olam Va'ed, you add the rest of the Torah portion, even though it's not part of the Zemirot properly, which we're going to sing for you as well. Here, this starts over here. Vatika Miriam Anevia Achot Aaron et Hatof biyada ותצאנה כל הנשים אחריה בתופים ובמחולות. ותענן להם מרים שירו לאדוני כי גאו גאה סוס ורוכבו רמה בים. Now that ends the Hai Na'um, because now we get to a portion of the Torah which is less exalted, and that's read in the regular Torah trope. Vayasang Moshe et Yisrael miyam suf vayetzeu el midbar shur vayelechu shalosh yamim b'midbar v'lo matzehu mayim vayaba'u marata v'lo yachelu lishtot mayim mimarat imarim hem al kein kara shema mara vayilonu hangam al Moshe lemor manishte vayitnach el Adonai vayorehu Adonai ngeit vayashlech el hamayim vayimteku hamayim sham sam lo. And then it switches back to that special Hai Na'um for the end of this verse until the end. Chok u'mishpat v'sham nisa'u vayomer im shamoan tishman v'kol Adonai Elohecha והישר בעיניו תעשה, והאזנת למצוותיו, ושמרת כל חוקיו, כל המחלה, אשר שמתי במצרים, לא אשים עליך, כי אני אדוני רופאך. And then the Tzachri continues, this Nishma. Actually, it's not perfectly accurate, but we'll get to that later. I wanted to point out something. The last bit of this Torah portion, the very last words, Kol hamachala asher samti mitzrayim lo asim alecha. God promises not to bring all the punishments, all the diseases, all the terrible things that he brought on the Egyptians onto the Jews. That verse is why in the Haggadah that we read last week, we do all this fancy math, trying to add on more and more and more punishments that the Egyptians received. How many makot did they receive? Was it 10? No. Was it 50? No. Was it 200? No. Was it 250? Why are the rabbis playing that game of adding more and more and more? Because the Torah promises that God will not bring the punishments that he brought on Egypt onto us. So they try to add as many as possible. Little throwaway, nothing to do with the seventh day of Passover, other than we read this verse, Kol hamachala asher samti mitzrayim lo asim alecha. Okay, after the reading and the Zemirot, we come to something on seventh day of Passover called Torot El, which we have sung before for Shabbat HaGadol. It's an introduction to the Nishmat that we sing on special Shabbatot called Consecration Shabbatot. And the seventh day of Passover, 1730, was the year and the occasion that the first purpose-built synagogue of our congregation down on Mill Street was consecrated. Now, the building of that synagogue in 1730 occurred. I'm missing a slide here. Oh, that's too bad. We're going to have to stop my share. I have to get you a new slide. Okay. Bear with me one moment. Okay. Here we go. Sorry about that. Okay, can you see my screen? In 1730, on the seventh day of Passover, a new synagogue was consecrated called the Mill Street Synagogue, so called because it was on Mill Street. Let's see. Nope. Not this one. Oh, I see. Okay, here it is. Okay. That small synagogue was the first synagogue building that was built by Congregation Sheretz Israel. Now, that is people make a big deal out of this. And just a few weeks ago, I was at a ceremony in Lower Manhattan. It was done by the Lower Manhattan Historical Association on April 8th, which was the secular anniversary for the building of the Mill Street Synagogue, for the consecration of the Mill Street Synagogue. And they talked about how the first synagogue in America, the first synagogue in America, the first synagogue in America. Yes, it is the first purpose-built synagogue in America. But it was not the first place that people prayed. Jews had been in New York since Dutch colonial days in New Amsterdam from 1654. Where did they pray then? They had a constitution since 1708. They had Torah scrolls. They had cemeteries. What do you mean they didn't have a synagogue? So the answer is, in the early days, in the Dutch and the British colonial period, they were not permitted to have public worship. So that meant that they had to pray inside their houses. And there is some indication that the home of Asser Levy was used as a synagogue. It's not, it's really speculative, but in his will, he has a very large amount of chairs and tables, with more than would be expected in the person's house. And so it's speculated that his home was used as a synagogue. Later on, we do know from 1695 until 1729, they rented houses in Lower Manhattan, first on Beaver Street and later on Mill Street, to be used as a synagogue. Now, these were not built as synagogues, they were just homes that they used as a synagogue, a house that was then used for a synagogue. But we know where they were, so those were the first synagogues in America and in New York. But what's the significance of the 1730 synagogue is that even though it was not officially legal, there was no legal permission to have public worship, the community was now confident enough, strong enough, large enough, wealthy enough to just do it. They went ahead and they built a synagogue. They purchased land and they built a synagogue without any official permission. They didn't even ask permission. They just did it. By that time, the laws had become liberal enough, or the government had become liberal enough, and they didn't have any problem. Earlier, they had asked permission and were denied to build a synagogue, or much earlier in the beginning of the 18th century. So now they didn't ask permission; they just went and did it. The first image that we have of the synagogue is from 1744. This is what I'm showing you on this page here. It's something called Grimm's map. I have a little enlarged here. This is about as contemporaneous an image as we can have of the Mill Street Synagogue. And here in the center is a more modern imagining of what it looked like based on this picture. As you can see, the thatched roof, the wooden, the brick walls, and these window arrangements. We know that it had a gallery, so it was pretty. It must have been 2 stories, or if it was 1 story, it was large roof, high roofs, because it had a men's section and a women's gallery. But it was a one family house kind of thing that was used as a synagogue, and the whole congregation could fit in it in 1730. So it was not very large. Not talking about large, not a lot of people. And many of the furnishings and furniture and furnishings from that first synagogue are still extant here today in our little synagogue in Sheretz Israel on 70th Street, which is what I'm showing you here. The 10 Commandments, these candlesticks around the Teba itself, smaller candlesticks that you probably can't see very well up in the front, and a few other objects from the small synagogue, the pews on the right here, all date from the 1730 Mill Street Synagogue. And there are ritual objects that we use throughout the year. I pictured here the Chanukiah, but there are others we've talked about in the past, the Rosh Chodesh boards. I'm going to show you the Sfirat Omer boards as well, and a few other objects that we use throughout the year from the Mill Street Synagogue remain in ritual use today. Okay. The synagogue was built by subscription and by free will offerings of members of our community. So in 1728, the president of the congregation, his name was Louis Moses Gomez, sometimes just Louis Gomez, sometimes just Moses Gomez, but that was his name, asked for people to contribute to the purchase of land for a synagogue, which they did. And here you have a listing of people who gave money in 1728 for the purchase of land for the synagogue. Moses Gomez, Moses Levy, Jacob Franks, Daniel Gomez, all these names from the early period of our congregation. That was not enough to build a synagogue, though. They were able to purchase the land. They went a long way, but it was not fully enough to build a synagogue. By the way, when they purchased the land, it was from a man named, now I've forgotten his name. It'll come to me after the presentation is over. But it was for a certain amount of money. I don't remember exactly. Not a full 100 pounds, much less than that, as well as I think 5 pounds of tea and sugar, which were included in the transaction. I don't think people do that as much today, but it was both legal tender as well as sugar and tea, which is what induced him to sell the property to Congregation Sheretz Israel. I'm just showing you here that we have records of all the people who gave money towards building of the synagogue, all the way back to the 1720s. Here is a long list of all the money that was raised for the construction of the synagogue. What I want to show you here is a few things. One is the huge amount that was given by the community of Curacao, much larger than any other donor, was the community of Curacao, 136 pounds, which, if you look, is by far the largest contribution. There were others. You can see the community of Barbados gave money. The community of Suriname gave 300 florins. I don't know what that amount actually equals. London gave quite liberally, and individuals from this community of Boston as well. So it's hard to imagine that there were, I don't think there was a synagogue in Boston, but they were, the community there, as small as it was giving money to the community in New York. Let's see what the chat says. Yes, Cornelius Klopper, that's exactly right. Thank you, Janet. And included in this list of names, it's not all, Hagavir, all these men, it's mostly men. But there are others. There's Rebecca Ashers, who was an elderly woman at the time. There's, let's see if we can find her. There's Rachel Lewis or Rachel Louisa. Here she is, Rachel Louisa. There's Simcha de Torres. I don't know if I can find her here, but there are women. Bilha Levy. So there are people who gave money, and not only men, also women of the community gave money towards the building of the synagogue as well. Um, now, so it was finally opened on seventh day of Passover, 1730. So it took them a few years from the purchase of the property till they were able to make the synagogue and consecrate it. It happened in the middle of the holiday, which I don't. It doesn't say anywhere if that was the original plan. In fact, I tend to doubt it. My guess is that they wanted it to be open uh, by the first day of Passover, but didn't make it for whatever reason. Whenever anyone's doing construction or work in their home, it never goes as planned. That's my guess. I don't know because I can't imagine anyone wanted to initially start something in the middle of the holiday. But nevertheless, they consecrated the synagogue on the seventh day of Passover. And from that time, that became a special day in the congregation. And I have copied for you here some evidence of that. So on the right-hand side, you'll see a quote from the Seder Chazanut of Yosef Yeshurun Pinto, who was the Chazan here from about 1755, 1757 till 1767 for about 10 years. He was extremely learned. In fact, people often said there were no rabbis in America before Abraham Rice in 1840. Yosef Yeshurun Pinto was an ordained rabbi. He didn't have a title rabbi. He didn't function as rabbi. He was the Chazan of the congregation. But he was educated in Amsterdam and had smicha. He was the Hachacham Hanavon. His title, when he dies in Amsterdam, he has a cemetery plot. He is given the title that scholars get. So he was a very learned man, and he was the Chazan here for about 10 years. And in his Seder Chazanut, which is he wrote down the customs of the Chazan, he includes customs in Amsterdam and London, where he had also served, as well as in New York. And he writes that on the seventh night of Passover, which is the anniversary of the consecration of the Esnoga in Sheretz Israel, the honor of opening the Heichal is given out before the beginning of the Psalm. If it's the Eve of Sabbath, they use the Psalm for Shabbat. The doors remain open throughout the service until the beginning of Yigdal. This is almost exactly what we still do today. They give out the honor of opening the Heichal before the Psalm is started. Then the choir sings the opening Psalm. And then the doors are open and remain open the entire evening service till the end of Yigdal. So it's almost exactly as he's writing about in the 1750s. And then he says the next morning, on the morning of the seventh day of Passover, they're opened again from the beginning of the Shirah during the Zenerot. They remain open through all the ceremony of all the Misha Berachs and the Hanotain, whatever is customary on that day to have been said. Then when the president comes to the Teipa to distribute the mitzvot, the honor of opening the Heichal is given out again. And from there, the usual procedure is followed, meaning now the special consecration service is over, and the rest of the holiday service continues after the Torah service. This is almost exactly what we do today. The president comes up, the ark is open the whole time. They make special mishverach and prayers for the day, and then the president comes up to do the regular Torah service. The ark is closed, and it goes on as usual. Now, this quote that I've read to you was translated from the Portuguese. Pinto wrote in Portuguese, and this comes from an article about Pinto by Herman Solomon. Underneath it is actually what the text of what one of the Misha Berachs was. They said a prayer for the congregants who had contributed to the building of the synagogue in 1730. That was said in Portuguese. Just think about that for a second. I said it before, but it bears repeating. By 1730, most of the congregation was Ashkenazic. By 1760, when Pinto is the Chazan, even more so, most of the congregation was Ashkenazic by that time, just in terms of raw numbers. Granted, many of the wealthier families were Portuguese traders, but I think that's not the only reason that the congregation was staunchly connected to its Portuguese heritage, because this was a Portuguese community in its origin, and traditional communities follow Minhag HaMakom. So if you're an Ashkenazic Jew and you move to a Portuguese community, you follow the Minhag HaMakom. It's a modern idea that people do the Minhag of their own Minhag wherever they are. No, the traditional thing is that you follow the Minhag of where you were. And this being a Portuguese community, even though majority of the people coming in 1760 were Ashkenazic. They follow the Portuguese minhag, which in this synagogue included Portuguese Mishnah Berach prayers. And here you have it for for blessing those who contributed to the building of the Mill Street Synagogue. We no longer say the Mishnah Berach. Maybe we should bring it back. I don't know. Maybe we'll talk to the president about bringing this Mishnah Berach back. But this is something that we no longer do. Another thing that we no longer do is this poem on the left, which was composed in 1808. It was quite interesting. This was a poem composed in 1808 for the anniversary of the Mill Street Synagogue. There's not a lot of Hebrew poetry in America at that time, and here is something interesting. It spells out an acrostic, She'erit Yisrael Chazak, and it's nice. There's nothing particular. I don't know what it was sung to. I have no idea how melody was used, but certainly that they must have had a melody. And I don't know where in the service they read it. But maybe here at this point when they're making the Mishnah Berach prayers, I don't know. But clearly this is something that was done and is no longer done from the year 1808. I'm not sure who wrote it. Probably the Melamed, probably the Ribi. His name was Piquet, Do Piquet probably wrote this, I imagine, not sure. Okay, what do we do today for the seventh day of Passover? What I'm showing you on the screen is the Chazan's handbook from Chazan Wachnon, James Mesod Wachnon, who was the Chazan here in the 1930s. And he has, and we have it in the archives, a manual, like a little handwritten book that he wrote himself, which has all the things that the Chazan needs to say, including, when you call someone to the Torah, what you say for if someone has Brit Milah, if someone has a daughter, if someone has a Mishnah Berach for a Bar Mitzvah. So the Chazan has all the text in front of him, including in that booklet is all the special consecration Shabbatot and services. And here is a service for the seventh day of Passover. This is after the Shachrit, after Kaddish Kabbalah, the end of the Shachrit. The choir will sing Lam Natech bin Ginot, which we're actually going to sing a little later tonight. And then the prayer for the government is read. That's called Hanotein Teshuvah. And then a Mishnah Berach for the congregation is said. That is what we do every single Shabbat. And then the choir will sing Tehillat Adonai. And then you have something that is very unusual that was added only on this day. That's 3 Mishnah Berach prayers. The first one is for Curacao, for the island of Curacao, congregation Mikveh Yisrael. The second is for the Yechidim, the individuals, the members of the congregation in London. And the third is for the congregation of Beracha V'Shalom in Suriname. And these are the communities that we saw earlier contributed to building the first synagogue. Why they don't include Barbados and Boston, I'm not sure, probably because the amounts were less. But these 3 communities get a Mishnah Berach prayer every year on the 7th day of Passover. These same communities get a prayer on Kal Nidrei. So they get mentioned twice. Then the choir will sing Va'anachnu, and then the doors of the Heichal are closed, and memorial prayers are read for 4 men and 3 women. And these are all individuals who were instrumental in building of the Mill Street Synagogue. First one is named Moses Michaels, Benjamin Mendes Pacheco, Moses Gomez, that's the same as Louis Moses Gomez. And interestingly, it says Harav Yaakov Bar Naphtali, that's Jacob Franks. Jacob Franks is, these are some of the wealthiest individuals of the community back in 1730. You don't usually think of Jacob Franks as a learned man, but he is consistently referred to as Harav, the rabbi or the learned man, Jacob Franks. One day we'll talk about that another time. After those, we say memorial prayers for these 3 women: Rachel Lewis, Simcha de Torres, and Abigail Franks. All of these people contributed money to the building of the first synagogue. That's the wrong way. So I tried to get pictures of some of these people. The only ones I could find are Jacob and Abigail Franks, because they're up here on the top right. They have portraits that are in the Museum of the City of New York. And just ritually here in the synagogue, there are bells. They actually date from 1734 or 1738. I forget exactly which year. A little bit after the consecration, Rachel Louisa, died, and in her will she left 10 pounds, which was not an insignificant amount of money, for the purchase of a Torah scroll and its ornaments. And the Torah scroll, I don't think we have anymore. I'm pretty sure we do not. But the ornaments we do. And these rimonim are the rimonim that were purchased for that Torah scroll in 1734 or 1738 from the bequest of Rachel Louisa. And we use them in her honor every single year on the seventh day of Passover. And so we will use them on Friday. And we use them occasionally at other times, other special days, but specifically here on the seventh day of Passover, we will use them as well. Not sure who Jacob Frank is. If that is, maybe it is to be confused. I'm not sure who you're referring to. Oh, you mean the Frankists? No, not to be confused with Jacob Frank, the false Messiah, the follower of Sabbatai Tzvi. No, definitely very, very different. Okay. Okay. I don't have any. I would love to have images of Rachel Lewis or Simcha Torres, but sadly we do not. By the way, one of the other customs that we do here at Sheretz Israel, which is really nice, is we invite all the descendants of these early families to come to the synagogue on the seventh day of Passover and to participate in the service. So this year, the Haftarah is going to be read by Jonathan Nathan. Jonathan Nathan's ancestor was Abraham de Lucena or Simon Nathan, people who worshipped in the Mill Street Synagogue back in the 18th century. For many years, Ruth Schulzen and her children would be involved in the synagogue. They don't live in Manhattan anymore, but they are descendants of Louis Moses Gomez and others as well. Most notably, that some of you who have been here for a long time might remember, Mona Oppenheim, Zichrona Levracha. Mona was a descendant of a man named several families, but the one that goes back to this period was Abraham Isaacs. And her family was involved with Sheretz Israel back from the days of the consecration of the synagogue. And every year, year in, year out, she would sponsor the Kiddush on the seventh day of Passover. And this year, the congregation is sponsoring the Kiddush in her memory to keep her memory alive as well. It's a nice connection to this period. Okay. Which brings us very soon to be at the close. This Omer counter here is another object from the Mill Street Synagogue that remains in use today. And it is a perfect reminder that today we are in the middle of Sfirat HaOmer. And if you have not done so, now, being after dark, is the perfect time to count Sfirat HaOmer. I have not done so yet, so I'm going to do it with you. You're supposed to stand up, but for the purposes of the Zoom, I'm going to do it while I'm seated. I hope the Lord will forgive me, because I think it's a lot better if you see my face rather than my chest or my stomach. So here we go. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sefirat haomer hayom chamisha yamim laomer harachaman yachazir avodat beit hamikdash timkoma bimhera b'yameinu. And then we sing this psalm. Lam natseach bin ginot mizmor shir Elohim yichonenu v'barechenu Ya'er panav itanu sela ladat ba'aretz darkecha Bechol goyim yeshungatecha yoducha namim Elohim yoducha namim יגננו לאומים, כי תשפוט נמים מישור, ולאומים בארץ תנחם סלע, יודוך נמים אלוהים, יודוך נמים כולם, ארץ נתנה יבולם, יברכנו אלוהים אלוהינו, יברכנו אלוהים, ויראו אותו כל אפסי הארץ. I have to imagine the choir. I didn't give you any choir recordings this week, so if you come to synagogue, you'll hear the choir doing it as well. It's really quite beautiful. And then finally, I'm going to leave you off with a curiosity. This is the last page in that little manual for the Chazan that the Reverend Wachnon wrote by hand. And in it is a piyut, a special poem that's written for the 7th day of Passover, about the Shirat Hayam, that it says here from the transcript of the late Reverend Moses Gedalia. That is the brother of my great-great-grandfather, my great-great-great-uncle. We are like this. And Reverend Wachnon transcribes it and puts it in his manual for the Chazan. So presumably, and I have no evidence of this other than this booklet, this was chanted in the synagogue. Exactly when? I'm not sure. Its placement in other Sephardic communities is known and is usually done before the reading of the Shirah, either during the Zemirot or in the Torah service before the reading of Shirah as a Reshut, kind of like Akdamut in the Ashkenazi community. But I really have no idea because it's not a tradition that we follow today. And I don't know how widespread it was, even here within the congregation. But Reverend Wachnon would not have put it in his booklet if it was not something he needed to have as the Chazan. So I have no idea what the melody is, and I have no idea when it was read. But clearly, this little poem, Ashira Kishirat Moshe Shir Lo Yinasheh, was recited by Reverend Wachnon, and apparently by my ancestors, Reverend Moses Gedalia, as well. That is my presentation for you tonight. I'm going to stop my share, answer any questions you have, and wish you all Mogadim L'Simcha. I'm going to ask you all. Oh, I'll stop.